In 1984, Wes Craven would craft one of the most unique and otherworldly entities within the horror genre, coming up with a completely different perspective to approach the slasher film from that would blow the world by storm. Not only was it critically acclaimed, but ended up being a massive commercial hit, spawning countless sequels, spin-offs, TV series, comics, and video games, capitalizing off of the terrifying persona the film's antagonist, Freddy Krueger, was able to convey. But what was it about Freddy Krueger that made him such an iconic horror icon remembered upon all the all-time greats? Despite how mystical and otherworldly Freddy as a character is, there remains a fragment of his representation that is still to an extent grounded in a certain perception of reality, which makes his presence so unnerving. I hope to deconstruct and identify what that may be. Most great horror films share the characteristic of approaching a concept from what I like to call a vulnerable viewpoint, in which the characters are most heavily exposed to harm from. It has been common for many horror films to associate this with a stranded setting where help is rare to come by, but this so-called vulnerable viewpoint can also be associated with a character's traits, such as a physical disability, or perhaps more so their body, forcing them to place themselves into vulnerable states in order to live their everyday life. A vulnerable viewpoint can help produce a level of relatability for the audience, but even more so places the established victims in an identifiably vulnerable situation in which tension and fear can be more easily built. What makes A Nightmare on Elm Street so unique is that it uses the concept of dreams as the vulnerable viewpoint in which the characters are exposed to harm through. The thing about dreams that makes it such a powerful viewpoint to present a horror film from is that although it is a component associated with how the body functions, it is very difficult for people to understand or even make sense of why they exist. A lot of what people do dream is heavily fragmented scenarios, often the product of their own fears, anxieties, and personal experiences that, although make sense at the moment of occurrence, are more often than not nonsensical to reflect back on. As scary as they may be, whatever we dream, we can be left with the assurance that it will never do real harm, at least in the real world.
Freddy comes from a land of dreams. And people are uncomfortable in ungovernable situations where they don't have control, I think Freddy is the perfect creature that comes from a realm where we have no control, who in this movie presents himself unbidden and unwelcomed. And, the nice thing about dreams are we can wake up in the morning and go about our day. If we couldn't, and there are mental ailments where indeed you can't, that's not a happy situation to not be able to escape from the realm of dreams. And Freddy escapes from the realm of dreams and pursues his victims. Not comforting.
Freddy Krueger is an intangible product of people's imaginations, capable of inflicting harm on the young and innocent exclusively within a dreamlike state. Despite being intangible, Krueger is a product of these characters' real-world struggles, as he can very much be interpreted as a formation of long-term trauma, repressed and ignored by their parents who don't take their children's struggles seriously.
This is Guy. He's after us in our dreams. But that's just not reality, Nancy. It's real, Mama. Feel it.
This can be linked back to Krueger's backstory as a real-life child molester who would continuously get away with his actions without consequence until the parents took action into their own hands and burnt him alive. To protect themselves and others, the parents repress any information associated with Krueger, yet the harm he has inflicted within the community still lives on. This backstory is barely even mentioned, but the little information that is shared is crucial to linking Kruger's influence over these characters as a form of trauma still shared throughout the town's community. The parental figures are seen disregarding these character struggles to an extent that is purposely comical in its inclusion.
See now, honey, you gotta cut your fingernails, you gotta stop that kind of dreaming. One or the other.
They will not act out of caution or concern until the situation is impossible to ignore, as their children's struggles are not perceived as genuine issues that need to be addressed. And when they are addressed, it's in a way that makes sense to the parents, but not the children facing the issue. The consistent disregard to the core reason behind these characters' struggles inevitably leads to real-world harm as a result of the lack of genuine support provided. Although Freddy is an abstract construct of these characters' imaginations, the harm inflicted is genuine. In many ways, it can be interpreted as a cautionary tale for parents to take adolescence issues seriously. The 80s was a common time for narratives to shift towards a more adolescent-oriented perspective that had been heavily ignored by the film industry in prior decades. This was most noticeably seen through the massive wave of coming-of-age films such as The Breakfast Club, Dead Poets Society, and countless others, which, through its perspective, would often have a very clear message to adults to take adolescence issues seriously and actually listen to what they have to say. A Nightmare on Elm Street deceivably fits into that perspective, while still adhering to the conventions of a typical slasher film. The strange thing about most slashers is that they are approached with a very conservative sensibility, in the sense that the characters who more heavily engage in taboo acts such as having sex, smoking, going out at night alone, presenting themselves in a sexualized manner, are often the ones that get killed off with unforgivably violent and painful deaths, while the more well-behaved person is typically rewarded with the status of the final girl. It's strange to think about slashers in that way, since they typically appeal to a young demographic, but when you think about the fact that most of these directors are middle-aged adults, likely parents, it starts to make a little more sense in how common the incorporation of that convention is. It is still present in A Nightmare on Elm Street through the sexually active dying first and the sexually interested dying next, but there is a more noticeable understanding of the adolescent's perspective, which is used to ground the narrative into a more relatable reality for its audience. This provides the film with an additional layer of depth that most other slasher films don't even contain. When you deconstruct Freddy as a character, it is more about what he represents to the audience that makes him such a terrifying villain to reflect on. He is a symbol of the consequences that come with a lack of compassion and understanding expressed from parental figures, and the destructive power that can have in worst case scenarios, approached from a genre that in its construction commonly disregards the importance of listening to an adolescent's perspective. This approach grounds Freddy into a reality that can be identifiable to its audience based on their own experience, despite how mystical and otherworldly he as a character may be. As a result, Freddy's persona brings various layers of meaning that can make for an experience that is simultaneously more real and alien than the average slasher film is successfully able to achieve.